This chair will not fix all your problems because then they're going to get really mad at you that it doesn't fly, it doesn't have a jetpack.
Our Offsite team speeds up the process by working on the back end with the documentation.
Most wheelchairs need what's called a home assessment. Welcome to the Offsite Team podcast, where we talk about all things DME, rehab, and respiratory. I'm here with my good friend April, and we're going to be talking about assessments for wheelchairs, documentation, and getting it right the first time. Because when we don't get our wheelchair documentation done right the first time, it leads to headaches for providers. The patients don't get their stuff on time, and we as the suppliers, we don't get paid. We have to do all sorts of work. So we're going to fix that once and for all. Right, April?
Correct.
Hopefully? Correct. That's nice of you to say that. If only it were that easy all the time. Well, hey, let's just dive into it. Most wheelchairs need what's called a home assessment, where we're just going to start with Medicare. Medicare says, in order to have a wheelchair in the home, you have to basically make sure it works in the home. Now, when doing an assessment, can this be done virtually? Can you do it over the phone, or do we need to actually go out to everyone's house to do these wheelchair assessments? What do we do?
Oh, basically, what we do is we actually go to the patient's house to do an assessment. That's the number one. However, as I have read, we can definitely do it virtually too. So we can do it virtually, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we are also checking in with the patients once we deliver the hospital bed. The wheelchair. I'm so sorry.
Well, hey, we're going to do a wheelchair and a hospital bed. No, but you're right. In-home, assessments for wheelchairs can be done either virtually or remote. You can do it over the phone. You just have to, we have a very simple checklist. If you don't have this checklist, just let us know. If you have an Offsite team member, we'll give you our checklist that we have, and you can say, hey, this is ABC DME's checklist to get it authorized inside the house. For us, it really varies. Our big thing with wheelchairs is we want to make sure the person's fit properly. I am an ATP, and it's hard because you can tell me someone's 5'2", 120 pounds, and I can use two completely different wheelchairs because we've all seen those patients. They're all thigh. Their upper body's nice and narrow, and they're all thigh, and you're gonna have to put them in a 20-inch wheelchair. And then there's other ones I've seen, we'll just pick on men, they're really, really skinny at the hip and all their weight's in their belly. We could probably get them into an 18-inch wheelchair, maybe even a 16-inch wheelchair. So you got to have that assessment to figure out what wheelchair you're putting someone into. Now, most importantly, Medicare wants the in-home assessment to make sure it fits through all the doors. I've gone into a number of homes where someone is getting a power wheelchair and it does not fit. It just doesn't. It's a single wide trailer, and they're like, well, I'm only going to use it outside. That does not work with Medicare. You can always take your wheelchair, scooter, or power chair outside. All that matters, according to Medicare, is using it inside the house. And we also have, there's a lot of split level houses. Well, is it going to be used upstairs? Is it going to be used downstairs? What does that look like as well, too? And it can kind of be a quandary. But it is also hard because if you're going to go out and do an in-person assessment at a house and then deliver it again, that's a lot of trips for someone. If you're only going to get a K1 wheelchair, that's a losing battle. Doesn't mean we won't do it, but there's a number of ways you can do something like that. So let's say we're working with a rehab company and they're on the cutting edge. They have at least one Offsite team member on their team. How does that help the wheelchair process, getting these wheelchairs covered for customers?
Well, number one is our Offsite team speeds up the process by working on the back end with the documentation.
Absolutely.
So they do reach out to the doctor's office to request for prescription and chart notes. And chart notes can be sometimes it's hard to obtain because we need to have certain coverage determination, like the requirements, clinical documentation.
And with wheelchair, you're looking at what are the MRADOs, the mobility-related aids to daily living that need to be either document what they're currently doing, or if they can't do them, what the wheelchair or power chair will allow them to do because of it. And they're really, really good at it. So we've had some of our, with our store, as great as our ATPs and rehab techs are, they have sometimes forgotten things. So what happens, they go out and do the fitting, they come back, they give it to our offsite team member. They're running through that checklist. They'll notice, hey, we're missing 2 or 3 of these. They take care of it for the technician to make sure, hey, we do need to figure out what's going to happen in this instance or that instance. So they're making sure all the boxes are checked. Every time there's a box that's not checked, typically that means we then cannot bill that item or there's going to be a problem down the road. The amount of money and time that it saves not only our team, but the provider and the patient is wonderful in what it does. So like what you said, yes, can in-home assessments be done virtually? Absolutely. In-home wheelchair assessments can be done virtually. Medicare said this is totally okay, but it's vitally important to confirm that the assessment can be done virtually before it is scheduled. This is because sometimes health professionals may not have the necessary equipment to conduct virtual assessments. Or, for example, if an in-home wheelchair assessment is done virtually, the healthcare professional might likely ask the patient or a family member to provide pictures and videos of the patient's home environment. That can really, really help. It really varies. Some people are great with iPhones or their Android phones, and other people, they're still having a hard time even picking up the phone. So it's really on a case-by-case basis, and I think we all know those customers. So in terms of our in-home assessments, do you have any other thoughts regarding that?
Well, for in-home assessment, I know that our delivery technicians are the one who's doing that. And the offsite team, it's very helpful for our offsite team to figure out what the documentations they will be requiring to the doctor's office, and it also gives them an idea of what the wheelchair, what patient needs, what kind of wheelchair, because I like that in here. Based on my experience previously, we only deal with a K1 wheelchair, so it's an extensive training that we do with our offsite team. Yeah. Like a lot.
Do you put them in a K1, a K2, a K3, a K4, a K5? I mean, they're all different, and it's one of those things. Medicare always wants us to build a K1. It's the cheapest of the cheap. But something as simple as a K2, a K1 and a K2 is the exact same wheelchair. For those listening to us who don't know it, all it is it's dropped 2 inches closer to the ground. They will pay for that any single time as long as you can document you're dealing with someone that's short and that they foot propel. So when we're talking to someone, and if I see someone on their face sheet, if they're 5'4" or under, I said, do you want to be able to foot propel as well too? That is more than likely, as long as we can get that into the chart notes, going to be an upgrade that we can offer. We talked about this in an earlier podcast. Same thing with K3 or a K4, K3 being a lightweight or K4 being a high strength lightweight. Those can be covered as well, but you have to have certain items go into the patient notes. And this is one of the great things with our offsite team. We have them running on the backside of things, or not running on the backside, messaging the doctor's office saying, hey, would you like your client to have a nicer wheelchair? We've noticed that they can propel a K4 chair, whereas they might have a hard time with the K1. And if they can get that into the file, a K4 wheelchair will be covered. Now, it has to be up to the standards of the LCD, but there's a way that we can word that. And it does not happen all the time. But if it's just enough, every dollar helps. As well as, I would much rather put my grandmother into a wheelchair that's 4 pounds lighter than not, especially if she's going to be in it next 4 or 5 years, if you know what I mean. Correct. So that's where it's really, really helpful to, in regards to the in-home visits, can they be done in-home versus virtually, as well as talking with the family members. Now, one of the things, if we're not currently doing, so a lot of times we have a general idea where the patient's going to go or what they're going to do. I always like to ask the patients, whether they're getting a scooter or a power chair, how do you intend on using this? Because they might think it's doing one thing, but I want to hear it out of their mouth. What do you plan on using it for? Because they might tell me one thing, I want this product, but they're only going to use it going to church, or they're only going to use it in certain instances. And I will take 2 people with the same diagnosis code and put them into different chairs based on what their end use is going to be. So that's an important thing. Always ask them, tell me how you're going to use this chair. What do you hope that it will do? And sometimes they're going to say, this chair is going to fix all my problems. I've had a lot of people say that. And at that point, you better correct them saying, this chair will not fix all your problems, because then they're going to get really mad at you that it doesn't fly, that it doesn't have a jetpack, that their spouse is still grumpy. There are all sorts of things, what it's going to do. So let's say we're working with the ATP, rehab tech, offsite team. We got everything done and we're ready to deliver the wheelchair. Now what? What happens next?
So once we deliver the wheelchair, we need to make sure that if the assessment has been done virtually, then that's the very right time to check for the assessment, to check on the checklist that we have. And then after delivering the wheelchair, what we do is we check them from time to time, like if the wheelchair have met the 5-year mark or prior to that. We also check in with the patient like our sales funnel does. So we check and see if there's anything, if they need to replace the wheelchair. That way we can work as soon as possible with the doctor.
It doesn't happen often, but I like what you said earlier about insurances and checking back in with the insurances. Sometimes it can take 3 to 6 months to get a wheelchair authorized. Doesn't happen a lot, but occasionally we will do all the paperwork for one insurance. Then we go to bill and they have changed insurances. This is why it's vitally important. We then check insurance again before delivery, because the number of times it's going to happen in January of 2024, people change insurances. And sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's different, but we need to make sure we know ahead of time, is this going to happen or not? Now, when we deliver the wheelchair, this is the perfect time. It's got to be documented that it can be used inside the house. Now, this can be done over the phone, because a lot of times what will happen is we can't get out to a really rural portion. We might say, hey, we can deliver this in this time frame, but they want to pick it up today. We'll have the patient drive down to our store. They'll pick it up in our store. But we also then need to follow up with a phone call saying, hey, can you use the wheelchair in your house? And then you just document that in Brightree. Hey, I talked to this patient or the patient's spouse. It can be used. That has to go into the patient file. It was documented on this day. Second, it's a wonderful follow-up visit, because you can then say, they might say, you know what, it can be used in the house. And you know that ramp that we were talking about, we need one of those as well too. So it's a wonderful time to complimentary sell at the same time on that follow-up visit. And so we can ask the family member after the wheelchair has been delivered, and then they can also provide us feedback. How was our sales process? What do they wish that we would do? Typically, I wish I would have gotten my wheelchair faster. We can't do that unless the doctor's getting us the documentation faster, or the third-party insurance is getting us back their stuff ahead of time. Now, you also mentioned the 5-year mark. You jumped all the way ahead to 5 years. So in terms of getting wheelchairs covered, because a lot of our patients, they're in them the rest of their life. What happens at 5 years?
Well, at 5 years, they're now, especially with Medicare, they're now allowed if they wanted a replacement, because if they're using it daily on a daily basis, there are lots of patients even prior to the 5 years, they're calling us for repair because the chair is broken. So when it hit, or prior to the 5 year, we want to make sure that we're checking in with them if they needed a replacement. That way we can work as soon as we can with the doctor's office in obtaining the documentation so we can bill a new one. That way we don't do repair every month, every other month.
Oh, exactly. Now, some insurances also pay for loaner wheelchairs while we are repairing it. And Medicare does this. Some of the third parties, it's really hit and miss. Medicaid, it's hit and miss. And this is where it's a little bit harder. But they'll pay for a 1-month rental if they can drop. You have to give them a loaner wheelchair. So you can sometimes get the replacement parts covered, the labor covered, and a 1-month repair covered when we bill for repairs of wheelchairs. And one of those things, it's not only the wheelchairs, it's also the accessories. So if typically, as long as the doctor prescribes them, you can get cushions, backrests, headrests, armrests, leg rests, trays. All of those add for comfort, safety, and functionality of the wheelchair. But some of them, if it's an E2611 cushion, that can be replaced every year as long as it's broken down. The other one is beyond repair, and that's what you're going to do is it adds to supplemental income that you can bill the insurance for wheelchairs. You're not going to get rich on a K1 wheelchair, but people also want their wheelchairs looking nice. And it'd be like, hey, I bought a new car, but I'm not going to put gas in it or change the brakes, except for once every 5 years. No one in their right mind would do something that crazy. It's the same thing with wheelchairs. And in the process of talking with our customers, about the wheelchairs, this is something that we need to talk to with the patients. And that's what the Offsite team does. So like, for example, the way we have things set up, we have a number of people. Well, we're large enough now. We actually have one person. All he does is work repairs. What's been some of the benefits of just having someone only work repairs?
It's good because at least we can have someone focus on the repairs, and at the same time he can master. So there are a lot of things that happens. What happened to the wheelchair? What are the repair? It helps broaden his knowledge because he's only working specifically on repair. So he's focused on what are the items that we need, what can we build to the insurance versus the insurance will not pay for us. So he knows about it, and he can focus on those patients. He can provide an update.
Yeah, and most patients, some of our geriatric patients typically have both Medicare as well as Medicaid. I love it when that happens because there's no out-of-pocket cost for those customers. But even if there is an out-of-pocket cost or a copay, people like to know what the options are. I can go a few more months, or I'm going to have to budget for this copay. What I've also noticed, we're frequently calling our patients. Let's say they've had the wheelchair for 2 years. We're still checking in with them every 6 months to make sure that the wheelchair is working appropriately when they're going to come in and service it again. But I've also noticed, let's take someone who has COPD and it's progressing, and that standard K1, 2, 3, 4 wheelchair is getting harder and harder to propel. We can ask them, hey, is it time to consider a power wheelchair? Actually, it is. Well, why don't we start working that process as well, too? And sometimes we can get way ahead of the process before it gets too bad, because what's hard is someone will say, you know what, I no longer have any strength to move the wheelchair. And then you're trying to work as fast as possible and get a power chair that really should have been authorized 6 months ago. And in some insurances, well, we need to see a PT or an OT. So it really helps us. Can we accelerate the process? And this is what the Offsite team allows us to do, because they have time to make the phone call, talk to the patients, tell me what's happened. There was a fall. What do you mean there was a fall? You're in your wheelchair. How can you fall? Well, I wasn't using the wheelchair that was prescribed to me. Oh, well, tell me more about that. So the more touch points that we can have with our patients and customers, the more we can help them out in the process. And this is what the Offsite team allows us to do. So here's some additional tips for getting people in the right items for their wheelchairs. Always make sure you have the decision maker in the process. A number of times I've gone out somewhere and I'm working with the caregiver, and really it's the daughter who's in charge. Typically, sorry men, I tend to notice like 90% of the decision makers typically are women in the household, but always make sure that the main person who's in charge of the decision making process is there. Make sure you're working with a qualified healthcare professional. This is someone, physical therapist, occupational therapist. A number of times it hasn't happened lately, but if you're a newbie getting into it, make sure you're not talking to a chiropractor or a foot doctor or someone who cannot write a wheelchair prescription. So those are good questions to ask as well too. Consider the wheelchair user's lifestyle. What do they do every single day? Some people, it's really simple. They just want to watch Jeopardy all day, go from point A to point B. Other people are very, very active. And then also, don't be afraid to ask for help. There are so many resources available to help you get the right items for your wheelchair. We have lots of contacts, so if you're working directly with us, we can give you lots of suggestions. Also, work with your dealers. For example, I used to say work with Invicare. Invicare's gone bankrupt, but work with your wheelchair dealers, whether it's a Permobil, Sunrise, Drive Medical, whoever you're using, Dynarex. Ask them, are there any samples you can give me? Do you have loaner equipment? Quantum's really, really good at this, where they'll actually bring us out loaner equipment to try with certain people. That way we don't have to go out and buy these items. So there are lots of different options in terms of getting the right items for the right people. In the old days, we used to get all sorts of demo equipment. That's pretty much dried up. But you can get a little bit here and there, and it's really, really helpful. April, what else have I forgotten to talk about in terms of like in-home assessments and getting people qualified for wheelchairs?
I think we pretty much covered everything, but if I can just add, our Offsite team is also up to date with the insurance because we have this so-called process like attending webinars, If there's any updates, we make sure that our offsite team are in there attending, just in case there's change.
And for example, like now, seat elevate features are covered on wheelchairs. That did not used to be the case a couple of years ago. So things are always changing in the process, and we're talking about this with the entire offsite team, which is great. Well, good. Well, hey, if you have if you have a good portion of your rehab business, we have several people trained in the offsite team. They're not ready quite yet, but they are close there. We are more than happy to work with you. And it's one of those things. We want to help your rehab team take even better care of your patients. If you're listening to this podcast, you're already taking good care of your patients, but we want you to take even better care of your patients. So go ahead and reach out to April or myself at offsiteteam.com or give us a call. We'd love to chat with you. So until next week, thanks, April.
Thank you.